Good morning from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark from spaceflightnow.com. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where United Launch Alliance is in the early stages of loading cryogenic propellants into an Atlas V rocket, awaiting liftoff this morning at 6:29 a.m. Eastern Time, or 10:29 UTC. This launch time is a little less than 2 hours from now. The Atlas V rocket will be launching the SBIRS GEO-6 satellite for the United States Space Force. This is the sixth in a line of missile warning satellites. Each of these satellites carries infrared sensors designed to detect the heat plumes from missile and rocket launches to provide early warning of an attack on either the U.S. homeland or deploy military forces or U.S. allies around the world. The SBIRS satellite is the sixth in the line of a space-based infrared system spacecraft, which began launching back in 2011. And this is the last of the current generation of U.S. military missile warning satellites. The spacecraft was built by Lockheed Martin. It's currently buttoned up for launch inside the payload fairing, or nose cone, of the Atlas V. That's the conical part of the rocket, the pointy end facing up, out at pad 41 right now. You're also seeing some vapors streaming away from the launch vehicle and the mobile launch platform, indicative of the ongoing loading of super cold propellants into the Atlas V. So with this fueling process now underway, the countdown is entering the final stages. The countdown began about 5.5 hours ago now, shortly after 11 p.m. Eastern Time. So the ULA's launch team has already been on station at the Atlas Space Flight Operations Center for about 5.5 hours. Earlier in the countdown, the launch team powered up the launch vehicle, powered up the rocket systems, tested the guidance system on the Atlas V rocket, and verified the GPS metric tracking system on board the vehicle is also ready for flight today. That's the system that's used by the range safety team at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station to track the location of the rocket as it heads down range to make sure it's not veering from its pre-approved flight corridor and potentially threatening populated areas. Also, earlier in the countdown during the overnight hours, ULA's crew out at pad 41 removed the cover over the flame bucket underneath the RD-180 engine and solid rocket boosters to clear the way for those engines and motors to ignite and send their exhaust into the flame trench at liftoff. The final closeout steps at the pad also involved removing final handrails and other equipment that's not necessary, with the crew now evacuated from the pad. And the crew did evacuate from the launch complex a couple of hours ago before the start of cryogenic tanking. So right now the pad is clear of all personnel, with the hazardous loading of cryogenic propellants underway at pad 41. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen will be loaded into the vehicle over the next hour or so. And we'll be tracking the progress of that tanking operation throughout the rest of the countdown. On the left side of your screen here, you can see the current status of tanking operations. The liquid oxygen tank on the Atlas first stage at last report was 10% full. The liquid oxygen on the Centaur upper stage at last report was 75% full. The RP-1, or kerosene tank, this is the rocket-grade kerosene that fuels the first stage main engine, was loaded into the Atlas V vehicle on Tuesday, shortly after its rollout to the pad from the vertical integration facility, the hangar in which the rocket was stacked over the last few weeks. That kerosene is actually stored at room temperature and can be loaded into the vehicle and can remain on board the Atlas V for a number of days or weeks if necessary, while the oxidizer, the liquid oxygen, and the liquid hydrogen are chilled to several hundred degrees below zero and boil off over time in the warm ambient Florida atmosphere. And therefore, those commodities, those propellants are loaded late in the countdown, and that tanking operation of the cryogenic propellants on the Atlas V just began around 4:15 or so this morning Eastern time. Now 1 hour remaining until the launch of United Launch Alliance's Atlas V rocket. The propellant loading process that's been underway for the last hour to hour and a half or so is nearing completion. The first stage of the Atlas V is now fully loaded with kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants. The Centaur upper stage is now full of liquid oxygen, the cryogenic oxidizer, and the liquid hydrogen tank on the Centaur upper stage is topping off to flight level at this time. At last report, it was 96% full. So now 1 hour, less than 1 hour now remaining until the opening of this morning's 40-minute launch window. The clock you're seeing on the upper right of your screen, the one at T-minus 29 minutes, is the countdown clock, the official countdown clock from United Launch Alliance. The clock there is heading down to a built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes. That hold will last for 30 minutes. So we've also added a clock below that. The time to launch clock is now just under 59 minutes remaining until the opening of the launch window. That accounts for that 30-minute built-in hold that is planned at T-minus 4 minutes. So that's the difference in those two clocks you're seeing on the upper right of your frame. You're continuing to look live out at Space Launch Complex 41, where the Atlas V rocket stands 194 feet tall, or 59 meters in height, and is nearing the end of its fuel and propellant loading process this morning for the launch of the U.S. military's SBIRS GEO-6 missile warning satellite. Now 52 minutes remaining until the opening of the launch window. As you can see, that countdown clock is at T-minus 22 minutes, heading to that built-in hold at T-minus 4. Right now, there are no issues reported by United Launch Alliance's team that could prohibit or prevent an on-time launch at 6:29 a.m. Eastern Time or 10:29 UTC. The latest weather forecast indicates an 80% chance of acceptable conditions for liftoff this morning during the 40-minute window. That's a slight improvement from yesterday's forecast, which predicted a 70% probability of good weather this morning. So weather is trending in the right direction. The only slight concern is with the chance of cumulus clouds associated with any offshore rain showers that may be streaming onshore over the launch pad area. Those clouds, if they do encroach too close to the pad, could have the threat of lightning in them. The rocket could actually trigger a lightning strike as it flew through those clouds. So that's what the weather team will be watching for primarily for the rest of the countdown. But right now there are no obvious weather concerns, and the weather is trending favorably for liftoff in 50 minutes and 40 seconds time. This will be the 95th flight overall of a Atlas V rocket dating back to August of 2002, and the 5th Atlas V flight of the year conducted by United Launch Alliance. If you're watching this live view, you just saw a security helicopter pass over and behind the launch pad. This is part of the standard pre-launch security sweep conducted by the Space Force to make sure there are no vessels or any aircraft in the exclusion or keep out zones around the launch pad area and the flight path of the Atlas V rocket. We just heard confirmation that the Centaur upper stage liquid hydrogen tank has reached the 99.8% mark. So that's near flight level. So ULA more or less has a fully loaded Atlas V rocket standing out on Space Launch Complex 41 at this time. With propellants now fully loaded onto the Atlas V rocket, the vehicle weighs about 969,500 pounds. This is just shy of 440 metric tons. The RD-180 main engine and the two strap-on solid rocket boosters will be generating 1.6 million pounds of thrust, or 7.1 meganewtons of thrust at liftoff. You can see this helicopter now passing behind and above the pad once more, heading northbound over the Atlantic coastline just beyond Space Launch Complex 41, where the Atlas V is 47.5 minutes from liftoff. Now 46 minutes and 12 seconds until the opening of the window. That clock is just about to pass T-minus 16 minutes. For more on the SBIRS GEO-6 mission, this missile warning satellite poised for launch this morning on the Atlas V rocket, we're going to play an interview that we had with Mike Correa. He's the vice president at Lockheed Martin in charge of the company's overhead persistent infrared mission area. That's the segment of Lockheed Martin's space division that is responsible for manufacturing these space-based infrared system satellites. So let's hear from Michael Correa on his thoughts and his discussion of the mission of SBIRS GEO-6.
I'm here with Mike Correa from Lockheed Martin to talk about the SBIRS GEO-6 launch. Mike, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what the SBIRS program does?
Yeah, Stephen, good morning. Thanks for taking the time to talk about SBIRS. So SBIRS GEO-6, as well as the other SBIRS satellite, is a satellite that basically has 4 missions. The first is missile warning. So it's got scanning and staring sensors that can see the Earth and detect a launch, and then using some algorithms determine where that missile is going to land. And so it's able to do the missile detection and warning, and then inform the decision makers or people in the United States about an incoming attack or to take appropriate actions. The second thing it does is missile defense. So the data from the SBIRS satellite can also be passed on to Missile Defense Agency so that they can task or queue assets to be able to shoot down or intercept the missile. The third thing that it does is it helps in the intelligence gathering. The SBIRS satellites can actually, as Russia and China and other nations build and test new missiles, the data from the sensors can be collected on those new missiles, and the intelligence community can do analysis about what those missiles, their capabilities are, or how they work. And then the fourth and final portion of the SBIRS mission is it really helps with battle space awareness. The cameras are sensitive enough to be able to take a look at the battlefield. That data can be provided to operators in the field, and so that they can understand what's going on and have improved awareness of the battlefield. And then most recently, SBIRS is also now starting to help you out some of the data with firefighting as well. So that's kind of a new thing as well. The sensors are able to help with that as well.
And can you talk a little bit about how the satellites actually make these observations? What kind of instrumentation or sensors are on these satellites to do their mission?
Yeah, so the SBIRS satellite has two separate payloads or 2 separate cameras. There's a staring sensor that can be pointed at and stare at a fixed point. So for example, you could task it to look over on China because there was something maybe you knew that you wanted to look at a particular area, or North Korea. And then there's a scanning sensor that basically kind of steps around in a U pattern, covering the Earth, and then kind of a classified amount of time. But that gives us the complete coverage of the Earth, and then the stare allows us to focus in on key areas of interest. So both sensors are infrared sensors, so they detect the heat signature of the rocket. So not only just the initial heat from the rocket launch, but also as the rockets go through the atmosphere, they get heated up and warmed, and we can track them through that heat signature as well. It's not just about the sensors as well. SBIRS GEO-6, as well as SBIRS GEO-5, is built on something that Lockheed Martin calls the LM-2100 combat bus. So this was an upgrade that we did with SBIRS GEO-5 and 6. We took our standard satellite bus and made some improvements to cyber harden the vehicle against attack. We also did some resiliency features, or added resiliency capabilities on the satellite to be able to handle adversary actions and be able to respond to those. We enhanced the payload. I mean, we enhanced the propulsion, the electronics, and the power subsystem to be able to give our our customers or the government, U.S. government, more mission capability. And lastly, we went ahead and made improvements to using common processes and digital tools to basically take out time in the build span. And we did those, but they did all that on SBIRS 5 that was launched last year, SBIRS Geo 6 now, and then we're going to do the same on Next Gen Geo, the follow-on program that I'll talk about more later.
You mentioned the missile warning and missile defense and battle space awareness missions for DoD. Can you talk about some other things? You mentioned firefighting, for example. That's kind of a new application. What other things have you found, or has the Space Force and the government found missions for SBIRS?
Yeah, there's not. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, I think that the big news is that SBIRS data is now helping with wildland fires. The sensor that data is being provided to firefighters to be able to find and locate the edge of fires and be able to fight them more effectively. I mentioned the intelligence gathering, where the sensor data is being used to characterize new missiles that are being developed by our adversaries, and then the battle space awareness as well. The cameras, when we first launched SBIRS Geo 1 a long time ago, performed much better than expected. The amount of detail that can be seen was, I guess, higher than anticipated, and as a result, has been proved very useful for battle space awareness.
You know, after the launch, after the spacecraft comes off the Atlas V, I know it goes through its own orbit raising and commissioning procedures. Can you walk me through like what happens from the time the satellite's deployed a few hours after the launch until it's in service?
Yeah, so obviously we've got a team here in Florida that's going to be doing the launch activities, but right after the satellite is launched, operators in Buckley Air Force Station in Colorado, I think actually Buckley Space Force Station now, correction, in Colorado, will be operating the satellite and getting it to its initial test orbit. There's about a week of activity to raise the satellite from where it's left off the Atlas V in the Centaur to its test location. From there, we will deploy the solar arrays. We'll open up the payload, or the payload, and we start with about a 45-day test campaign where we go through and test the satellite bus systems to make sure that they're working appropriately and everything is nominal, trying to make sure that there's no issues there. And after that initial 45-day test, we turn our focus to the payload itself and the sensors. And there's an extensive calibration scenario where we turn on the payloads for the first time and get first flight. And then we go ahead and calibrate and tune the sensors to make sure that they are operating per parameter. And then finally, there's a trial period where the satellite has been calibrated, the satellite has been tested, the sensors have been calibrated, and we're now actually just using it in a trial period to go collect launches as they happen around the globe and make sure that the sensor is detecting things nominally. And then officially after that period, the government will declare the satellite operational, and that will then officially put it into service. So that timeline on Next Gen Geo 5, as an example, we launched Geo 5 in May of last year, 21, and we got to operational acceptance in February of this year. So it's about a 8-month process, something like that, in terms of going through those various steps.
I know this is the last satellite of this program, the SBIRS program. Can you talk a little bit about maybe just your feelings on that milestone as you transition to the Next Gen program, and specifically what will that next generation program entail from Lockheed Martin's perspective? What are you guys developing for that?
Yeah, so first off, it's kind of bittersweet. This is, as you mentioned, the last in a series of 6 Lockheed Martin built SBIRS satellites. We've got our friends and family out here this week to watch that launch with us and celebrate. So, you know, the first thing is we're just really going to enjoy that launch tomorrow morning. For what we're doing next is in 2018, Lockheed Martin was put on contract for the follow-on to SBIRS. That's called Next Generation Overhead Persistent IR System, Block 0, or we call it NGG, Next Gen Geo. That satellite is based on the LM-2100 combat bus, and it includes those cyber hardening features, the resilient features, and the enhanced payload and electronics, or enhanced propulsion and electronics. It also takes those resilience features and turns the volume up to 11. So we add more there in terms of capabilities for our customer, and we do things there faster than we would on the SBIRS satellite. We're currently just got through with the CDR portion of that program last year, completed all of our critical design reviews. We are now in the process of integrating the first vehicle. So we've got in Waterton, Colorado, we're assembling the electronics panels with all of the RF and bus hardware. Our propulsion core is being built in Stennis, Mississippi, where we're actually welding all the tanks and the propulsion tubing in there. And then we've got 2 payloads that are being currently built by Raytheon and Northrop Grumman. And we're expecting our first payload from either of those companies early next year. So we're excited about Next Gen Geo. We're excited that it takes what we've done on the LM-2100 combat bus, turns the volume up to 11. It includes, enhanced sensors that from both Northrop Grumman and Raytheon that are capable of seeing even more than the SBIRS class of sensors. And then, so that's where we are.
And when is that first Next Gen Geo launch scheduled right now?
Yeah, so we're scheduled to launch in 2025. Currently, kind of the latter half of 2025. But obviously, the manifest is not yet published that far in advance. But we'll launch SBIRS or Next Gen Geo SV1 in 25, SV2 in 27, and SV3 in 28.
Okay, Mike. Thank you for your time and good luck with the mission.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Have a nice day.
That was Mike Correa, the Vice President at Lockheed Martin in charge of the Space-Based Infrared System program and Lockheed Martin's other programs in the missile warning and missile defense area. Talking about the SBIRS GEO-6 satellite poised for launch this morning from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This is a missile warning satellite for the United States Space Force, built by Lockheed Martin. The spacecraft weighs nearly 5 metric tons fully fueled for launch. Heading up to a perch in geosynchronous orbit about 22,000 miles or nearly 36,000 kilometers over the equator. It will join 5 similar satellites in the SBIRS network to provide global missile detection and missile tracking coverage. As you can see in the upper right of your screen, the countdown clock has reached the built-in hold at T-minus 4 minutes and holding. This is a pre-planned hold in ULA's Atlas V countdown to allow teams to catch up with any open and unfinished work. The launch team will also be polled later on in this hold for a go or no-go to enter the terminal countdown, the final 4 minutes of the countdown leading up to liftoff. The time to launch clock below that T-minus 4 minute clock is the time remaining until the opening of this morning's launch window. We're now streaming a view from the causeway down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, showing the Atlas V rocket poised on its launch pad, venting oxygen vapors. And this view comes from our camera location at the Kennedy Space Center press site, roughly 4 miles west of the pad, looking east. After liftoff, the Atlas V will be heading due east over the Atlantic Ocean, heading for its equatorial geosynchronous transfer orbit, on the way to a final orbit for the SBIRS GEO-6 satellite that's about 22,000 miles or 36,000 kilometers directly over the equator. It'll take about 3 hours for the Atlas V rocket to maneuver the SBIRS GEO-6 spacecraft into its targeted elliptical transfer orbit, and then SBIRS GEO-6 itself, after separating from the Atlas V launch vehicle, will perform its own orbital raising maneuvers with its own propulsion system over the next few days to a couple of weeks or so to maneuver into its final orbit. In the last few minutes, ULA's launch team has loaded the trajectory file for today's mission into the Atlas V's guidance computer. This trajectory file takes into account the observations of upper-level winds made throughout the countdown overnight by wind balloons that have been sent aloft by the weather team at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And the trajectory file loaded into the guidance computer is the optimum trajectory for the Atlas V to fly through the atmosphere and steer through these upper-level winds this morning on the way to orbit with the SBIRS GEO-6 satellite. ULA's team has several trajectory files available, and they select the one that best fits with the upper-level wind observations on launch day. Also, in the last 20 minutes or so, we've heard confirmation that the fuel fill sequence on the Russian-made RD-180 engine on the first stage of the Atlas V has been completed. This is a part of the conditioning process to ready that engine for start. That engine will be ignited at T-minus 2.7 seconds just before liftoff, and it will ramp up to full throttle and go through a health check before the command is sent to ignite the two strap-on solid rocket boosters on the Atlas V, allowing the rocket to begin its vertical climb off the pad. Today's mission will be the ninth flight of an Atlas V rocket to fly in what ULA calls the 421 configuration. This 421 vehicle configuration comprises the Atlas V variant with a 4-meter payload fairing, seen here in this graphic produced by United Launch Alliance. This 4-meter metallic fairing encloses the SBIRS GEO-6 spacecraft, which you also see here in this illustration. That's the numeral 4 in the 421 name. The number 2 represents the fact that there are 2 strap-on solid rocket boosters on this mission. These boosters are called graphite epoxy motors, or GEMs. These are GEM 63s, the 63 meaning they're 63 inches in diameter. And these strap-on boosters will burn a little more than a minute and a half in the first minute and a half of the flight to give the rocket an extra burst of energy off the pad, and these boosters are produced by Northrop Grumman. The number 1 at the end of 421 represents the fact that there is one RL-10 engine produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne on the Centaur upper stage. As you can see in this graphic, the Atlas V has an RD-180 main engine on the bottom of the first stage. This is a dual nozzle kerosene-fed engine supplied by MPO Energomash, which is a Russian engine producer located outside Moscow. And as you can see, the RL-10C11 engine powers the Centaur upper stage. One note on this graphic from ULA, this graphic is a little bit outdated. The EZIO-5 and EZIO-6 spacecraft, these are 2 small rideshare CubeSat type payloads, are no longer actually flying on this mission. They were removed from this launch due to concerns about orbital debris mitigation with these small satellites heading to such a high orbit. With this SBIRS GEO-6 spacecraft heading to an orbit, it'll deploy off the Atlas V in an orbit ranging between about 3,000 miles and 22,000 miles above the Earth. So that's the 421 Atlas V configuration set for launch this morning. The 9th flight of an Atlas V 421, and the 95th flight of an Atlas V overall. The first signs of sunlight, first light, now visible on the eastern horizon here on Florida Space Coast. Looking out from our location here at the Kennedy Space Center, there are some scattered clouds on the horizon, but clear skies overhead. A beautiful morning for a launch on Florida Space Coast. Now 13 minutes and 34 seconds remaining until the opening of the launch window. ULA has again confirmed that all weather parameters are currently go for launch of the Atlas V rocket this morning. Once again, the payload on this mission is SBIRS GEO-6. This is the sixth and final geosynchronous satellite in the U.S. Space Force's space-based infrared system. This is an artist's illustration from Lockheed Martin showing what the SBIRS GEO-6 spacecraft will look like in orbit with its antennas and solar panels unfurled. The satellite weighs just shy of 5 metric tons, fully fueled for launch. It's based on the LM-2100 satellite bus. And again, this is the sixth and final SBIRS GEO satellite. This is another Lockheed Martin illustration showing what the fleet of SBIRS satellites look like in orbit. This is a notional illustration showing the SBIRS satellites in the ring, a geosynchronous ring around the equator, 22,000 miles or 36,000 kilometers above the Earth, along with SBIRS HEO, or highly elliptical orbit payloads, in these circular or oval-shaped, orbits that fly over the North Pole to provide polar coverage of missile launches and missile threats that could be approaching the U.S. homeland. These satellites collect infrared data to detect the heat plumes from missile launches. They can also detect things like the heat generated during a re-entry of a space debris or spacecraft. And these satellites are also used now to help detect wildfires across the United States and around the world. The Atlas V rocket will take about 3 hours and 1 minute to deploy the SBIRS GEO spacecraft. It'll be using 3 burns of its Centaur upper stage over that 3-hour period, targeting an orbit ranging between about 3,200 miles to 22,000 miles above the Earth at an inclination of 17.6 degrees to the equator. And the SBIRS GEO spacecraft, after deploying from the Centaur upper stage 3 hours and 1 minute after launch, will be activating its propulsion system and performing a series of burns over the following days to reduce its inclination to 0 degrees over the equator and to circularize its orbit at 22,000 miles. Now, less than 11 minutes remaining until launch. We're about 4 minutes away from the expected time of the go-no-go poll of ULA's launch team to verify their readiness for launch. This view of Space Launch Complex 41 shows the Atlas V fully fueled for launch. You can see a security helicopter in the background here near the launch pad. And you can see some of the clouds just offshore. These clouds are some of the clouds being watched by the launch team, the weather team, but right now all parameters are go for liftoff. We're standing by for the go, no-go poll from ULA's launch team.
L minus 7 minutes.
Status check to proceed with terminal count. Atlas systems, propulsion.
Go.
Hydraulics.
Go.
Pneumatics.
Go.
LO2.
Go.
Water.
Go.
Centaur systems, propulsion.
Go.
Pneumatics.
Go.
LO2.
Go.
LH2.
Go.
S-gas.
Go.
Electrical systems, airborne.
Go.
Ground.
Go.
Facility.
Go.
RFFTS.
Go.
Flight control.
Go.
GCQ.
Go.
Operation support.
Go.
COM.
Go.
Umbilicals.
Go.
ECS.
Go.
Redline monitor.
Go.
Quality.
Go.
Op safety manager.
Go.
ULA safety officer.
Go.
Vehicle system engineer.
Go.
Anomaly chief.
Go.
Range coordinator.
Clear to proceed.
Launch director.
Launch vehicle is ready to launch.
Mission director.
You have permission to launch.
Proceeding with the count. ALC verified T0 set for 10:29
Verified.
You just heard the word from ULA's launch conductor. The team gave a unanimous go for launch at 6:29 a.m. Eastern Time, or 10:29 UTC. That poll was conducted by ULA launch conductor Ron McKee. We just heard confirmation that the SBIRS GEO-6 spacecraft is configured for launch, now operating on internal power. 5 minutes to go. "30 seconds until the countdown resumes at T-minus 4 minutes and counting for the 95th launch of an Atlas V rocket and the 5th Atlas V of the year."
Minutes and holding. We anticipate releasing the hold in just a few moments.
4 minutes and counting. 3, 2, 1, mark. 355.
Ground pyros enabled.
And the countdown has resumed at T-minus 4 minutes. Over the next few minutes, the propellant tanks will be pressurized and the Atlas V will transition to onboard
The countdown
power.
clock has resumed and we are go
Leading
for
up to
launch
liftoff at
at
6:29
6:29 a.m. Eastern. With liftoff approaching, we're going to raise the volume on our launch team so you can hear the final preps.
We'll listen in to ULA's launch team for this final phase of the countdown.
Three minutes.
Securing LO2 topping.
Atlas tanks to flight pressure.
250.
FPS internal.
159. 157. Vehicle internal. 155.
Launch sequencer start.
150.
Securing Centaur LH2.
Securing Centaur LO2.
140.
Launch enabled.
137.
T-minus 90 seconds. The launch vehicle, payload, ground systems, and eastern range are go for launch.
120.
OCU's armed.
SCS count started.
110.
Vent valves locked.
T-minus 1 minute.
Rock report range status.
Range green.
Forty seconds.
Stable at step 3.
28. 25.
Status check.
Go Atlas. Go Centaur.
Go Sabres.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff of the Atlas V rocket for United Launch Alliance, carrying Sivers GO6 for the United States Space Force.
Passing 30 seconds on flight. Vehicle is now 2 miles in altitude. And the RD-180 is now throttling down as expected. Engine response looks good. And the vehicle has completed its roll maneuver. Passing 50 seconds in flight. Mach 1. Atlas V is now supersonic. Vehicle is now passing through max Q, maximum dynamic pressure. The RD-180 is now throttling back up as expected. Engine response looks good. Standing by for SRB burnout.
You are hearing the voice of Jesse Gonzalez providing launch vehicle ascent data.
And coming up on 90 seconds into flight. And we have burnout on both SRBs. And the RD-180 is now throttling back up as expected. Vehicle is now 20 miles in altitude, traveling at 3,000 miles per hour. And we have indication of jettison of both SRBs. And the vehicle has gone to closed loop guidance. And the RCS system is now pressurizing to flight levels. And the reaction control system pressures have reached operational levels. The vehicle is now 45 miles in altitude, about 100 miles downrange, traveling at 6,500 miles per hour. And the RD-180 is now throttling to maintain a constant 5G acceleration limit. Engine response looks good. And the Centaur has begun the boost phase chill down sequence to thermally condition the RL-10 for operation. And the RD-180 is now throttling to maintain a 4.6G acceleration limit until BECO. And we have BECO, booster engine cutoff. And we have stage separation. Seeing good pre-start on the RL-10. Standing by for MES-1. And we have MES-1. And we have good indication of payload fairing jettison. This first burn will
This
be
is
about
Atlas
8.5
Mission
minutes.
Control at T+5 minutes. We just heard flight commentator Jesse Gonzalez confirm the successful completion of the early phase of today's flight, and all systems continue to operate nominally.
Now, 9 minutes into the flight of ULA's Atlas V rocket, you saw a picture-perfect on-time liftoff of the Atlas V from Space Launch Complex 41 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. And a good climb out, good burns of the RD-180 engine and the 2 strap-on boosters from Northrop Grumman. And right now, the RL-10 upper stage engine on the Centaur upper stage is firing for the first of its 3 burns on today's flight to place the SBIRS GEO-6 satellite into orbit.
This is Atlas.
This Centaur burn is nearing the end of its firing. The RL-10 engine is about to shut down after placing the
And we have
SBIRS satellite
main engine cutoff
into a parking orbit, and we've heard confirmation of main engine cutoff number 1. This coast phase will last about 10 minutes until the Centaur upper stage and the SBIRS satellite reach the proper location for main engine start number 2. That's expected at T plus 23 minutes. That burn at T plus 23 minutes will raise the apogee or high point of the spacecraft's orbit and the orbit of the Centaur stage to roughly 22,000 miles or so. And then a third Centaur burn, roughly 3 hours after launch, will raise the perigee, or low point of the orbit, and move the inclination closer to the equator to set the stage for deployment of the SBIRS GEO-6 satellite at around 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 13:30 UTC, 3 hours and 1 minute after launch. ULA is now ending their live webcast. So we won't have any more live animation feeds from ULA, unfortunately, for the remainder of the mission. But we'll bring you continued updates on spaceflightnow.com and on social media throughout the remainder of this 3-hour mission. Now T plus 19 minutes and 40 seconds. Just to recap where we are in the SBIRS GEO-6 mission. The Atlas V lifted off from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station from Pad 41, which you're now seeing empty here on the Space Coast of Florida. The liftoff occurred at 6:29 a.m. Eastern Time, or 10:29 UTC, to begin the 5th Atlas V launch of 2022. The Atlas V headed downrange, arced out over the Atlantic Ocean, due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station on 1.6 million pounds of thrust from its RD-180 main engine and 2 strap-on solid rocket boosters. Those boosters burned for about a minute and a half, then jettisoned a few moments later. And the first stage's RD-180 engine shut down about 4 minutes and 12 seconds into the flight. That was followed very quickly by stage separation, Atlas Centaur staging, and then the Centaur upper stage ignited its RL-10 engine from Aerojet Rocketdyne for a first burn to inject the SBIRS GEO-6 spacecraft into a preliminary parking orbit, a low-altitude orbit. That's where it's at right now. Also, early on in that Centaur burn, the Atlas V jettisoned its conical 4-meter diameter payload shroud. One note of trivia, this was the final flight of the classic conical-shaped Atlas V payload fairing from Cape Canaveral. All future Atlas V's, 21 now remaining to fly in total, will fly the larger 5-meter fairing configuration, except for one more 4-meter fairing that will launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base out in California later this year. So sort of an end of an era on the cusp here for ULA as the Atlas V nears retirement, and this was the final flight of this particular configuration of the Atlas V, the 421 with 2 strap-on boosters. The 9th and final flight of this configuration. And again, 21 more Atlas V's left to fly in total in different versions, different variants over the next few years. So mission stats now. This was the 677th flight of an Atlas rocket, or a rocket bearing the Atlas name, since 1957, and the 378th Atlas launched from the Cape. It was the 266th flight of a Centaur upper stage and the 101st launch of an RD-180 main engine since that engine debuted on the Atlas III rocket in 2000. It was the 95th flight overall of an Atlas V and the 37th Atlas V flight in service of the U.S. Air Force or Space Force. The RL-10 engine that I mentioned on the Centaur upper stage goes way back to the 1960s in various different versions. It's been upgraded numerous times since then, but it was the 513th flight of a production version of an RL-10 engine, and actually the second flight of this particular upgraded variant called the RL-10C1-1. It was the 152nd flight by United Launch Alliance, since that company was formed in 2006 by merging Boeing and Lockheed Martin's rocket divisions. And it was the 9th flight of an Atlas V in this configuration, as I mentioned before, the 33rd orbital launch attempt from Cape Canaveral this year, and the 5th Atlas V launch of the year. At this point, we're standing by for confirmation of the ignition of the Centaur upper stage for its second burn. We just received that confirmation from ULA. ULA is continuing to provide updates on their website and on social media. We'll pass those along as we get them. The broadcast from ULA unfortunately ended before these other critical milestones that are left in the mission this morning. But this burn is expected to last approximately 5 minutes or so, just shy of 5 minutes, to begin boosting the SBIRS GEO-6 missile warning satellite into a higher orbit closer to its final operating position. We'll stay on the air until we do get confirmation of this completion of this Centaur burn. The third Centaur burn is still about 2.5 hours away, and we'll provide updates on that on our website and on social media on our Twitter account when we get that confirmation, as well as confirmation of spacecraft separation and the official declaration of the success of the mission if everything goes according to plan. This is the first of 2 launches scheduled today from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. Here's a view of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket taken before sunrise this morning on Pad 40, just a mile and a half, or about 2.5 kilometers south of Pad 41, which you're seeing on the inset on the right of your screen here. These 2 pads about a mile and a half apart. And this Falcon 9 rocket is set to launch at 7:08 p.m. Eastern Time this evening, 23:08 UTC, with the Korea Pathfinder lunar orbiter. This is South Korea's first mission of space exploration and South Korea's first lunar mission. This is a mission that will be heading to orbit the moon and will be launched on a Falcon 9 rocket this evening, about 12.5 hours, 12 hours and 39 minutes actually, after the launch time of the Atlas V this morning. And if these 2 launches both occur today, the Atlas V already has. If Falcon 9 remains on schedule and does take off this evening, that'll be the shortest turnaround or span between 2 orbital class launches from the Space Coast of Florida since 1967. And back in 1967, there was a launch, 2 launches just shy of 10 hours apart. And the overall record for 2 space launches or orbital class launches, the shortest span between 2 types of missions like that in the history of the Cape, is dates back to NASA's Gemini program, when Agena rockets launched about an hour and a half before Gemini missions lifted off on Titan rockets from different pads down at Cape Canaveral. So that's the overall record. 99 minutes is the shortest ever turnaround between 2 launches from Cape Canaveral. And in second place, just shy of 10 hours. And today, the teams are going for the 3rd place position in those rankings at 12 hours and 39 minutes. This chart shows the trend of orbital launch attempts from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station dating back to 2000. This chart is broken down by different launch providers, most commonly SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, and also the Space Shuttle back in the 2000s timeframe. You can see that trend line has been increasing in recent years. This was the 33rd orbital launch attempt from Cape Canaveral or the Kennedy Space Center so far this year. The record going into this year, going into 2022, was 31. So that record has already been beaten by 2 launches now, 33 launches in the books from the Eastern Range here in Florida so far this year. And you can see that SpaceX in blue here is responsible for the lion's share of the increase in launch activity here in Florida. Here's another shot of Pad 41. We're awaiting confirmation now of the cutoff of the Centaur upper stage engine. And we have confirmation of main engine cutoff number 2 on the Centaur's RL-10 engine. So this completes the 2nd of 3 burns for the Atlas V rocket's Centaur upper stage this morning. The rocket is now in a 2.5-hour coast phase. It'll be climbing to an altitude of thousands of miles above the Earth over the next 2.5 hours before reaching the proper altitude and position in space for the 3rd ignition of the Centaur upper stage. That ignition is expected about 2.5 hours from now. That burn will last about a minute, 58 seconds to be exact. And then that will set the stage for separation of the SBIRS GEO-6 missile warning spacecraft from the Centaur upper stage at T+3 hours and 1 minute. That separation is timed for 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 13:30 UTC, which coincidentally is the same time of the next launch we'll be covering on spaceflightnow.com, which is the scheduled flight of Blue Origin's suborbital New Shepard rocket from West Texas. carrying 6 passengers on a suborbital trip to the edge of space. We'll be covering that launch and streaming Blue Origin's video feed on spaceflightnow.com at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time or 13:30 UTC. At the same time, we expect to be hearing confirmation from ULA of a successful deployment of this $1.2 billion missile warning satellite SBIRS GEO-6, which we saw depart from Cape Canaveral now 30 minutes ago. With the Atlas V now off the pad at Cape Canaveral, here's a look ahead at some of the launches we'll be covering over the next couple of weeks. These are the launches that we have confirmed target dates for from various sources. Again, I mentioned later this evening, SpaceX is set to launch the Korea Pathfinder Lunar Orbiter mission, KPLO, from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station at 7:08 p.m. Eastern Time or 23:08 UTC. This weekend, on Saturday evening, U.S. time, the Indian Space Research Organization is set to launch a new rocket in its inventory, in its fleet, called the SSLV, the Small Satellite Launch Vehicle. This is a smaller launch vehicle than their other rockets, designed to carry microsatellites and CubeSats into Earth orbit. It'll be carrying an experimental technology demonstration Earth observation satellite called EOS-2, launched from the Satish Dhawan Space Center on the east coast of India. Again, the first flight of a new Indian rocket scheduled for Saturday. And then later in the month, there are 2 more Falcon 9s that we have confirmed target dates for right now on August the 9th and August the 16th. Both of these missions will be carrying Starlink internet satellites to orbit. The August 9th launch will take off from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. And then on August 16th, a few miles to the south, back to Space Launch Complex 40, or Slick 40. Another Starlink mission is set to fly on August the 16th. These are just the launches that we have confirmed target dates for right now. There are other launches on the books during this time period. We're just not sure of the dates quite yet. SpaceX is preparing a Falcon 9 to launch later this month from Vandenberg Space Force Base. The latest estimated schedule we had for that was early August, but that may not be the case. It may be pushing into mid-August, but we don't have a confirmed date for that. That's a Starlink mission from Vandenberg Space Force Base on a Falcon 9 rocket. And of course, later this month, we'll be covering the liftoff of NASA's Artemis 1 mission on the maiden flight of the Space Launch System moon rocket from the Kennedy Space Center. That launch is currently targeted for no earlier than August the 29th. If you want to help us support, help support our coverage of all of these launches and other space industry activity, you can join our YouTube channel, and you can also contribute on Super Chat on our YouTube channel. We appreciate all our contributions that we receive there. Our members do receive access to some exclusive video features on YouTube, and of course you'll be supporting our coverage and helping us bring you content like we brought you this morning. You can also go to our Spaceflight Now store at shop.spaceflightnow.com. That is shop.spaceflightnow.com. You're welcome to go there, and we have mission patches and other memorabilia on sale on our Spaceflight Now store, and the proceeds from that also go toward continuing and expanding our launch coverage. So with that, we're going to sign off our live stream from the Kennedy Space Center this morning, but we'll be back this evening for the Falcon 9 launch at 7:08 p.m. Eastern Time, or 23:08 UTC. So please join us then and keep track of all of the launch activity going on today on spaceflightnow.com. Until then, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Have a great day.